So moving on to the bio note of Dr. Anurag Verma, he is an academician, researcher, consultant, and practicing architect with more than 25 years of varied professional experience. A consultant to organizations in government sector and corporate consulting NGOs. He is currently professor and executive director at Chandigarh University. Now moving on to Anand Khatri, sir, bio note. Architect Anand Khatri, sir, is a professor at AIT SAP. He is BArch from GCA Lucknow and MArch from SPA Delhi, and the founder of Urban Village Charitable Trust, UVCT, a research repository working on urban villages and villages within the cultural geography of the Indian subcontinent. Over to you, sir. Your voice is not audible.
Thank you, Richa. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy that I could join Professor Anurag Verma after a very, doubtful morning today. I'm very happy that he could join us today for this discourse. Today we are discussing in the context of vernacular and traditional. We are discussing. Is my slide visible? Is my voice clear?
Yeah. So please make it on slideshow mode.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in today's FDP, we are discussing the historic, the traditional, the cultural, and the vernacular. And the idea is to understand how these topics, which are actually correlating and interrelated with each other, have to be worked on, looked at, how researchers have been referring to them, where to draw a line. Because most of us who are researching in the area of vernacular or traditional or historic get entangled with these terms. Also the domains are not fixed. There is so much of interchange and there is so much of fluctuation. We keep on talking about vernacular and then we call it cultural. There are authors who have been looking at the neo vernacular as vernacular. In the modern trend, there is this whole talk on critical regionalism, local modernism, and neo vernacular, whereas there is so much of parallel reference to vernacular and cultural also happening parallelly. So there are certain frames that we had selected. I would like to highlight on the frames that we have selected for discussion. The epistemological frame is the first frame that we discuss, which is followed by the etymological frames for referring to vernacular. Then we try and connect vernacular across the historic, traditional, and cultural, along with the new emerging vernacular, which is the neo vernacular, the critical regionalism, and the local modernism. We try to refer to these three frames, while we will refrain from referring to environment and sustainability, restoration and conservation frames, because these are going to be separately taken up by other following speakers. So etymology is relating to the origin and historical development of the words and their meanings. In fact, almost all of us are in agreement that vernacular is something which came in focus of architectural studies somewhere around the 80s in India, wherein we started looking back as to how we have to respond to our regional understanding of architecture, how we have to work on issues pertaining to climate, issues pertaining to history. So that is the time when architects started looking back around 70s and 80s, when they started looking at how architecture could actually relate and could emerge from its local settings. So to be able to distinguish between historic, traditional, cultural, and vernacular, there is a basic outline that I have tried to prepare from dressing, so wherein a sari is something which is very vernacular. It is spread across the country as a clothing. It becomes cultural when it is worn in a particular style with a particular definition for a particular festivity in a particular region. This goes by the second example, and it becomes a traditional wear for festivity, and for long sustained culture, it becomes a tradition. And when it comes to historic weaves like Banarsi and so on and so forth, it becomes something which is historic. So these are the four strands which we need to understand when we start referring to architecture. In fact, there was a question in our previous discourse on sustainability, environment, IGBC, and vernacular. So calling somebody fat or a fat person was considered to be healthy way back in 60s. He was considered to be strong way back in 60s. But the definition of health is very different from the definition of health in 60s. So we need to draw these lines to be able to research. And we also need referrals to definitions. So the definitions of vernacular, cultural, traditional, and historic come from certain references which are broadly in use today. Modern helps us define all these four from what modern in itself is, and so on and so forth. Designer interventions, arties, casual, formal, grunge, chic, vintage, bohemian, and ethnic. These are newer definitions which are all emerging from information of the basic strands, the information of vernacular, cultural, traditional, and historic. In fact, today's age is an age where everything is mixed up, and we have to pick up our choices and go on to define what we want to look at for addressing neo-vernacular, critical regionalism, and local modernism. So, in terms of the definitions of historic, there are two very important things that come into our minds. One is the significance, which is the age, which is the belonging, and so on and so forth. So, part of historic is very administrative. Part of historic is very, very related to our heritage, our country's heritage. But then historic has a lot of value systems embedded in it. These are cultural significance, the intangibles, the art, music, dance, and poetry. Then there are traditional techniques that are a part of historic, techniques of construction. There are a lot of value systems, processes, and details which are historic. Then there is a vernacular connection to vernacular knowledge, without which historic could not have come up at its point of time when it was built. Then its connectedness to events and records. Then there is evidential information, fiscal, legal, and administrative information. As I had earlier said, that was a part of the administrative process of historic. Then there was a significant representative type, because, say, for example, a tomb is considered to be historic. Then it is historic because it carries so many values of different kind of tombs which are there, and it puts together a definition. It is helping to put together a definition of use, a definition of typology, and a definition of how people relate to it. So it is only after it does fulfill these conditions that it becomes a historic structure. So then it has to be a significant representative of the type, as I said. It has to have a genealogical, referral, long-term, indefinite, and research value. So now when we go down to the epistemological frames, as Professor Habib Khan had already put it earlier, vernacular cannot be taught without process. But when we look at the overall diagram of vernacular, cultural, traditional, and historic, there are certain things that come to our mind. Vernacular in the 19th century, that is around 1980s, 70s, as we all talk about, came into being because of the birth of networking and information. There was a complete movement away from the process of crafts, which was earlier a way of connecting to architecture, and we moved on to a different type of architecture starting from the 1970s and 80s. And that is how networking and information is a border which actually encases the definition of vernacular and the search for it. An interconnected world. So there are a lot of authors who say that vernacular and architecture are just opposites. There are authors which say that vernacular refers to an architecture which has already died. So the interconnection of the world raises a big question and throws light on what is historic and what is cultural, what is localized, traditional, and vernacular. Vernacular, in any case, is inevitably at the root of all these three terms, yet defined by migration and mixing knowledge systems, which were not there earlier. There was only localized knowledge. Research and documentation. Research and documentation in the international scenarios started much earlier, like the time when the US destroyed its native footprint of civilization, when all of the native residents of Canada were destroyed. So they started researching into their lives, and even quite a lot of our footprint in India was destroyed pre-independence. So research and documentation began with that. But the idea of a profession to be able to look into and research into the documented facets of its own knowledge systems is something that gave birth to vernacular. Then the rising sensitivities is something that gave birth to vernacular. The dialogue on climate change, as everybody feels that there is a big overlap between green, climate change, and vernacular. The new age thinking, one world consciousness, UN mandates, and SDGs, and the economic way of looking at everything in life. These are the aspects that have given birth to the existence of vernacular. Otherwise, vernacular was a craft. It was a way in which everybody would build his own house. So, giving you the example of how I understood vernacular over a period of time, working with manpower and labor with whom I was working, I would know that this particular point of time in the year when they take their money saved over almost 5-6 months back home, they would go and make bricks. In another time they would go and buy some other thing and deposit some money, and then in the final scene, in the third year, they would go and do the casting of a roof, or they would, and then they would go and plaster it. So over a period of 4, 5, 6 seasons, their house would come up. So one might call it economic limitation, but beyond economic limitation, it is personal association. It is a craft. It is a way of making your own house. It is a way of carrying forward a knowledge system. So in the hierarchy of terms in between vernacular, traditional, cultural, and historic, we see that there is a particular sequence that it can follow. Now, vernacular being of the people, being with occupational knowledge, economic crafts and trades, and it is something which carries utility of labor and time shares of people, and scales of at the scale of a village, at a scale of intimacy in geography and geomorphology, with no aesthetics. I'll call it as no aesthetics because here I have used a diagram on the development of aesthetics, wherein the ease of use and the recurrence of use leads to the development and adoption of aesthetics. So I would prefer to call vernacular as something which is a very evolutionary form of aesthetics. When the recurrence of vernacular happens over a period of time, then it becomes traditional social knowledge. And when it becomes traditional social knowledge, then it becomes inherited over a period of time into the culture of a bigger region. Culture is regional. So architecture refers today to cultural values, but and traditional processes and vernacular ways of building. But when it comes to historic, it has to have the scale of time attached to it, and it also has to be the epitome of aesthetics. Before I go to the next slide, Anurag sir, would you like to add something to it? Anurag sir, you are muted, sir.
You can just continue. Maybe we can speak about what do we understand vernacular.
Okay.
You've already explained it, but maybe we can open up a larger discussion on this.
Right, sir.
What is it precisely and what it is not?
Right, sir.
So we can comprehend the understanding also.
Right, sir. So taking you further into the discourse, this is a photograph by Miki Desai on historic and traditional. When we look at this particular picture and try to start defining the way this particular system of carving or the way this particular system would have evolved in Rajasthan or in Gujarat or in any part of the country where this kind of stone construction is being used, then I would draw you to the top left-hand corner image of vernacular, which is pator. So they were aware of a construction technology of dry masonry, which is called pator in Rajasthan. And this particular awareness of stone including the inclusion of the folklore and the traditions of Krishna, which is celebrated so much there, and the awareness of wood, carving in wood, projected onto the stone, and also the inbuilding of a water body on the on the first floor level in this building, reflecting oasis, in the desert, along with jalis coming from an awareness of fabric, an awareness of the weave in a fabric, is something that gives birth to a historic and a traditional significant architectural vocabulary. So it is so much of intangibles, so many contributions that are actually catering to the birth of something which is historic and traditional. Coming to the next slide, this is a typical slide which students use to project what is vernacular architecture. I had picked up just a slide, which would be talking to it. So it has regional information, it has material construction techniques, knowledge of structural systems, geometry, culture, and climate changes put together, a geometrical understanding of plan, windows, exteriors and interiors, settlement size and patterns, clusters, and a plan geometry. So clusters become more important to vernacular than the individual plan, than the individual detail, because that is what is, vernacular awareness. Now, the awareness of material used in vernacular comes over a long period of time. Now, say for example, mud. We are all aware that mud is a, material which is used in a lot of parts of our country for vernacular construction. But starting from feeling it on your feet, to eating it, to making small models of houses, to cultivating in it, leads to the knowledge of use of mud in making a particular built form. Here I use Richardson's quote, wherein he says vernacular is a contradiction in terms of work of architects. There is a big diversity between a craft and an art. He argues that vernacular cannot be practiced by architects. And as Professor Habib Khan also said, that when doing his part of vernacular through his definitions in buildings, he would stand on the side to see which window goes where. And he says that this is something which an architect does not get paid for, but for the satisfaction of doing something sustainable and vernacular, he would do it. So it has to carry a big content of craft in it, and that is what is vernacular. Now, while trying to define the future and lateral linkages and frames, there is an effort to work on what is critical regionalism, neo-vernacular architecture, localized modernism, traditional architecture, and contemporary architecture. So when we look at so many multiple frames and the frames of how researchers have been referring to vernacular construction, would be realized that there is depth to the subject, and it can be differentiated amongst all others for better learnings. So this is I would not like to go into these terms in a lot of detail, because although there are definitions and examples which I have put in here, but I personally feel that all faculty members are aware of examples of critical regionalism, like Doshi's works, like neo-vernacular, like Revati's works, like localized modernism. A lot of people call Cobb's work as localized modernism, and traditional architecture, being practiced again, and contemporary architecture, as we see in the works of Professor Habib Khan, with extreme sensitivities to vernacular. His work also is something which I would include in the neo-vernacular architecture. Now, this is a Dobrial house, which a friend of mine had tried to do with me, and he tried to construct and reconstruct, with a lot of discussion on using the same material that was there available in a region in Garhwal. And he built his house. He was very passionate. He's an IT guy, and tried to redo his house. Now, despite so much of semblance in between a modern house today and a lot of details adopted for doing windows with double shutters, with an external facade and internal double shutters, wherein a shutter inside the shutter opens for the colder climate and the other shutter remains closed. And the height of Toran, I mean the door form, and two Jogindars, I mean they call the alcoves next to the doors as Jogindars, two Jogindars next to it. Despite him putting in, and the slate and the tiles used for paving and on the steps of the house, procured from a nearby ruined house. So despite all this, I refuse to call it vernacular. I would call it new vernacular. And all these efforts, since because his engagement level was very high, to some extent it becomes inclined towards reproducing life in modern day, which is similar to what it would have been in vernacular times. Now, when we look at Taj Mahal, in fact, this slide I had put in for questioning from you all, but somehow the results are also showing along with the image of Taj Mahal. But nonetheless, I would take it up as a discourse instead of putting up questions. So there are certain historic values to Taj Mahal. If you actually look into Taj Mahal, it says that it's a jewel of Muslim art in India. It has got construction, material, and detail value. It is an epitome of architecture and a representative sample of tomb typology and is most visited. It has a plan geometry and optical corrections in the plan geometry also. And it shows aesthetics evolved over 200 years of stay in India. Now, when you look at Taj Mahal for these values of historic, then there are cultural values also. The cultural values of Taj Mahal are the culture of doing royal tombs for the royal families, a processional path, which is there in Taj Mahal, which is also a part of most of the Islamic buildings, and a Mughal garden surrounding tombs, which is happening in most of the Mughal tombs in our region, and enclosures formulated by walls, because Mughal gardens had to be fed with water, and that water would be on the walls, which would carry a water channel. But there are traditional values also to it, and these traditional values are something which are not a part of the Islamic vocabulary, independent of the Indian influence. And one of which is Jawab, as in large complexes. When you look at large temple complexes, you see Jawab, a reflection of a build on either sides, which is happening in Taj at multiple levels. Then there are religious structures on the banks of India, or structures on the banks of river, not India, rivers, and then inclusion of water in settings as auspicious, elevated plinths for integrating building complexes, balanced to central structure by theme elements, public buildings and gardens. Beyond these traditional values, there are intangible social and aesthetic values also, which actually help us relate to the Taj Mahal. And these are the values which I would say belong to the vernacular way of thinking. One is pride of art, that pride that we have such beautiful art despite being subjugated by the British for a very long time. Our art outstands, our building arts outstand. Love in social context, it's a mausoleum of love, awe and inspiration, monumental scale, belonging to an era of past and henceforth past glory, post-independence, reassertion of pre-British glorified past. So these intangibles, these social values are something which rest with Taj Mahal. There is some amount of research that we had done and knowledge probes that we have done to look into historic cultural, traditional and vernacular. But what we understand out of our research on vernacular is that we need to look at the future from the lens of the past, and certain amount of information can be taken, and definitely there have to be very strong drawing lines drawn in between these terms, so that research does not get confused, and in fact, the whole dialogue on utility of labor is something which is a part of vernacular. Paul Oliver, who's a author on vernacular and related subjects, and in fact was one of the pioneers who took up the construction of an encyclopedia of vernacular buildings internationally. He says that there is no such thing as traditional buildings, but rather building that embodies certain vernacular traditions. So he has tried to deconstruct tradition in the light of vernacular. But nonetheless, these constructions and deconstructions of words keep on happening. But while taking up researches on the subject of vernacular, we have to look into the subject of outlines. We have to look into the outlines of all these, terms. In fact, I would like Professor Anurag to explain the chart that follows this particular table from a report by Amos Report. Amos Report had made certain significant remarks along the lines of vernacular. We try to look at the frames that certain researchers are looking in. So in the case of Amos Report, he says that a perspective of environment behavior studies, which takes an interdisciplinary approach to the scientific study of how people and environments interact, is important. Any development of explanatory theory of environment behavior relation, which could change over time. He said that the study of lateral linkages and connections was important. Then study not buildings alone, but systems of settings within which systems of activities take place, relationships between high style and vernacular elements. But the frames that he adopts for these studies are biosocial, psychological, and cultural characteristics of people leading to shaping the environment, which is not happening now. And we are not taking ownership of where we are living. We are not actually accepting our houses. We just go and stay. It was only yesterday when my wife asked me, can you change a tube light? Do you know how to change the tube light of a particular room? I said that, yes, I know. And I did that. She was fairly happy. So I would not generally take ownership of doing it, leave aside doing anything significant in the house, but engaging in the build where we are. We have left our build to others to come and shape, to others to build for us. But our engagement has to be there. Then only there can be answers to climate change. Then only there can be ownerships and responsibilities. So it's an act of responsibility to take charge of how you are living, where you are living, what you are building, beyond economics. Then understanding of the physical environments affect people's behavior, mood, and well-being. This is something that Amos Report had said very significantly in his report. Then a corollary question that he puts in says that given a mutual interaction between people and environments, there must be mechanisms linking them. What are these mechanisms? So he puts up a table in which he defines process characteristics and product characteristics. This is a very interesting table. In fact, Professor Anurag, if you would like to take this table up right now, it is good. Otherwise, I'll go through the rest of the lot and then we can come back to the table. So, so let's come back to the table in a few minutes, time. Then there is another researcher, Thanos, who researches on Santorini. So Thanos has tried to research on vernacular from four basic standpoints. He says that vernacular can be looked at only from the perspective of the elements, fire, water, air, and earth, which is very, very novel to Occidental understanding. Only the Orients talk of these four elements in general, but he has explained how the site of Santorini, which is supposed to be the Atlantean site, and a big volcano happened, and the volcanic ash, which has cement-like properties, is being used for plasters, it's being used for binding stones, and then how a vernacular system with thin roofs and further on covered by pumice is used there, and how aseismic features like rich corners, thin walls, and thick walls, and buttresses and tendons are used. So this is what Thanos explains are the elements, and he has provided the table against fire, water, air, and earth as balancers. In fact, if I tell you that Santorini has got an elevation of over 80, 90, 100 meters from the level where the sea is and the level where people stay. So when you look at the sea from the top, you see a huge catamaran or a huge boat like a small ant, crawling on earth. So the geography is very different. And there are a lot of cave dwellings also in Santorini. I brought this example of Thanos because of the uniqueness of referral frames that he has used for researching on vernacular. And then we have Paul Oliver, who has written two very important books built to meet needs, cultural issues in vernacular architecture, and the Encyclopedia of Vernacular, wherein he takes up a lot of cases on vernacular. He makes certain significant remarks on vernacular, which says that in varying degrees, all buildings constitute parts of the vernacular architectural traditions. The diversity of building being expressions of the different demands and values of the cultures concerned. He has advocated certain study frames wherein he says that we must define the field, and we must understand the culture and context, the tradition and transmission in vernacular, hazards and dwellings, conservation and continuity to be addressed, and suburbs and self-builds in modern vernacular. He says he's the first one to argue that in case of some amount of um, uh, in case of climate change and disaster management, individuals have to come to the rescue of architecture. So mass housing and mass construction awareness and people's participation is important. So say, for example, there is a small earthquake in a village, wherein every house is shaken and some amount of roofs have fallen. You would see that everybody from the village is engaged to build it. But if it happens in our cities, they take years to construct. Where do we get so much of manpower and material to readdress calamities like earthquakes and floods is to be understood. So the frame which he has chosen, to address vernacular is from the perspective of such natural calamities. Then he also says that meeting the challenges of housing in the 21st century requires the use of these frames. And he says that we must address these frames in the sense that we must try and find out adaptations of vernacular solutions which people can use for making their own housings, like the slums, like the urban informalities, like the shelters, which we call nowadays in Delhi, the DSUI, Delhi Urban Shelter Board, wherein they have stopped calling it a slum. So this shelter construction, working on vernacular becomes important. Working on the knowledge of people becomes important. Working on how they would be using it as a solution for their living becomes important. And then supporting vernacular traditions to ensure sustainable solutions to the rising demand is something which is important. Lindsay Asquith uses similar frames to what we have used in our beginning today. In fact, the epistemology, etymology frames have been taken from Asquith's understanding of how to address vernacular. But she is very clear wherein she says that vernacular is a process. Lindsay Asquith worked with Paul Oliver, and she has got in-depth understanding through working with Paul Oliver also, and her own research into the subject. And then she says that building traditions, understanding control and authority, endorsing indigenous knowledge. So these dialogues of Lindsay, apart from epistemological and etymological understanding and the linkages of vernacular to present day practices, are something which is different. So while Paul Oliver, when I was talking about Paul Oliver, I was saying that Paul Oliver is strictly, where is Paul Oliver? Paul Oliver is here. Yeah, Paul Oliver believes in certain degrees of interventions wherein he has tried to take in a very practicable approach here while talking about sustainability and talking about future needs. Lindsay goes into a more academic frame on trying to generate a vernacular design as a model system. And then she talks about the generative concepts in vernacular towards new methodologies also. But when we go on to research furthermore, and we look at Kingston W.M. Heath, so he has called vernacular as primarily extinct, but then he tries to say that if vernacular is when representative members of people within a region embrace aspects of a unique building response in a consistent manner, they produce something that is no longer idiosyncratic. It is culturally syncretic. So it is vernacular. So he has tried to define vernacular as culturally syncretic. And then he tries to bring in the dialogue of folk, which is stabilized vernacular. He gives the example of the prayer flags, which is much in use at a lot of places in Egypt, like the Egyptian eye. It is in use in Leh, Ladakh, and much of the hill areas. So he says that that is a part of the folk. So we see the prayer flags hanging inside cars. We see prayer flags happening everywhere. So vernacular reaches a particular level when it gets stabilized, and it can be called as folk. And then he tries to say that extinct vernacular is a vernacular form where it reaches a point of relative stasis within its environment. Folk or stabilized vernacular may be, something which is in transition, and evolving vernacular and extinct vernacularity can be distinguished. So he has these four scales of referring to vernacular, and that's about it. Let's go back to the table and try and discuss this table further with Professor Anurag and have his views on the discussion. Thank you.
So you are on mute.
Anurag sir, you are on mute.
Right. There are a few things. Initially, I'm sorry that I couldn't be very well prepared for this, but this was to be the opening, but now I'm preparing it as a summary of what Professor Anand has already explained. So can I be allowed to share a few slides which are not rightly formatted, but maybe readable?
Yes, sir, please, please.
Thanks. Is the screen visible now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, it's
Yes, sir, it's
visible.
visible.
All right. All right, so I'd like to address, ideally, I would have wanted this to be in the form of a question and answer session and a discussion session, because I think we need a lot of clarity on what really do we mean once we allude something as vernacular architecture. So I'll give you a few classic definitions, and this is going to be theory now, since we are addressing a fora of teachers only. So let's get into the theoretical part of what vernacular is. Now, a few classical definitions are that Rudowski, 1964, amongst the beginning of the writings on vernacular architecture, the keywords are there in the blues. So one is that it's communal architecture, not by specialists, spontaneous and continuing activity, and this is a keyword, people with a common heritage. The people who are a community who spontaneously act without necessarily involvement of a specialist to produce communal architecture is what we will call vernacular architecture. In lack of a generic label, it can be called as vernacular, anonymous, spontaneous, indigenous, or rural. I'm not sure how many of you would have heard about barefoot architecture and a kind of a debate which was commenced when barefoot architecture got an award for, I think, a Aga Khan award for architecture without involvement of professionals. But that is something that you must definitely refer to. The second thing, which is a repeat more or less of the first one, communal architecture as a communal art, not produced by a few intellectuals or specialists, but by the spontaneous and continuing activity of a whole people with a common heritage. Now try and understand this in contrast with the kind of architectural movements that all of us have studied in our architectural education. Let's say postmodernism, modernism, deconstruction, or whatever. We understand that there's a lot of theory to that. And if you look at the definitions of Rudowski, there's nothing which is called a theory there. That means it's not a theoretical exposition of production of architecture, right? So it can be reflected in the roots of the word. Vernacular is derived from the Latin word vernaculus, which means domestic, native, indigenous. And one of the words that Professor Anand had used in his presentation could be used here as folk. So the word vernacular derives from the word native. And so calling vernacular architecture as the native science of building could be appropriate. This is a definition by Paul Oliver, who's known to be amongst the early researchers looking into the domain of non-professional architectural practices and non-architectural modes of production. Now, there are various aspects. This is again from Paul Oliver. Aspects of vernacular architecture which have to be looked into, that we should, as teachers, try and comprehend and look into, is what is it that the subject of vernacular needs. One is definition. Definition means how do we understand or how do we call some architecture as vernacular? Let's say if there is a village somewhere close to Greater Noida, the architecture there, will it be called vernacular or will it be rural architecture? Whether it alludes to the same, whether it is related to the process of production of architecture, whether it relates to the kind of people who've created architecture, how is it that we define the domain of vernacular architecture is something that we should look at. Now, cultural character is again something which we need to look into, because this is something that Professor Anand had also brought out very clearly and very starkly. And we all also understand that architecture is understood as a manifest symbol of culture of a time. We know that, right? We say that any architecture at any place is an embodiment of the cultural values of a place at a time, right? So that is another aspect that we need to look into. And we have to be very clear that it's not only the visual aspect that we are talking about, right? Visual also is one important, significant part that we need to look into, but not the only one. The next is transmission of skills and values. Transmission happens over a period of time. What gets transmitted is skills. We know that we keep on learning. Possibly if you would have looked into certain larger temple complexes, you could have observed that it starts off small. You can also observe that in the series of tombs that come up. You can also observe that in the series of generation of the stupas, right? We start off small, then we keep on experimenting. We keep experimenting like, let's say we are taking an example of a tomb. It starts off with something which is very small. Then we add colonnades over there. Then we add landscapes. So we start off with something which is very small in the medieval times, which actually finds a final expression in maybe Taj Mahal, right? They are all prototypes or typologies of a tomb. But that is how the skills and values keep on enhancing to create masterpieces, right? Whether the architecture is in response to the vulnerability, perceived vulnerability to hazards, I think we are in a stage wherein if we study sustainability closely, we'll understand that the indigenous people were much more conscious about the vulnerability of a settlement. I don't know whether you read this book by Amitav Ghosh, which talks about the vernacular being amongst, not the vernacular, but they say that all these most prized architectural properties that we talk about, the river fronts, the ocean fronts, the mountain top structures, they are the most vulnerable to hazards, the natural hazards. Vernacular architecture was relatively safe. Only that it was vulnerable to the vagaries of time. They were not constructed normally out of very durable materials, but over a period of time, we understand that significant prominent buildings, like let's say if religion is important, then maybe the religious expression. If during the feudal times, if the king was important, his palace. Let's say during the Harappan times, if the granary or the food store was important, the granary, most of the time, the permanent structures were more hardy than the local vernacular habitats where the conventional people stayed. building conservation, popular housing, architectural education, etc. Now, these are the issues we need to address if we need to comprehend aspects of vernacular architecture. It's closely related to know-how acquired as efficiency is tested over time. Now, we understand that most of the time the temple builders were people who were practicing this craft through generations. And the learning was transmitted from one generation to the other. The challenges were new. The culture was changing. Culture is not a monolith. Culture keeps on mutating. Culture keeps on evolving. And the manifest symbols, architecture in this case, keeps on responding to these cultural stimuli, to the skill upgradation stimuli, to the kind of skillsmanship of individual people, to the kind of material availability, and the architecture as a manifest symbol reflects all these influences. So a limited degree of design is involved, but the architectural solutions have been arrived over generations. So we are not saying that a degree of design is not important, because we do something, we learn, we apply, we improve. So once we are saying design here, it's in the conventional, it's in the non-conventional sense in which we understand design. That means design as designers, people who may or may not be the end users, people who may or may not be really acquainted with the cultural beliefs of a place, people who may or may not be acquainted with the cultural processes of a place and things. Now, if we are studying about the relevance of vernacular architecture, or else if as teachers, if we need to impart it to the students or to make any professional interventions, these are the issues that we need to address firsthand. Now, the phrase vernacular architecture is thus very significantly being defined as the buildings of and by the people. That means that the people are custodians of the building. People are the repositories who embody the knowledge of creation of the building. It needs to be understood how do the cultural traits and the environmental contexts of a particular place at a certain time constitute the focus of vernacular traditions in buildings, which have often existed for centuries. Now, this is something I'd like to explain through an example, maybe. Let's say if we are talking about the domestic architecture today in the urban areas of our country, India, then would it be an exaggeration to say that it's predominantly driven through the builders? You may have an opinion on that. But we can also say, as Rahul Mehrotra often points out, that most of the time, the housings that we are coming up in urban areas are a result of the frenzied capital, right? So if we are saying something like this, we are saying that most of the time that the buildings which are coming up today are not really rooted in one, the place, two, in the community. We know that we come up with categories like lower income groups, higher income groups. These are anonymous users of any property, right? So that means it's agnostic to who may be the user, not that we don't think about it, but to us, it's a generic typology. We don't know the people exactly who are going to inhabit the architecture that we as designers tend to create. Okay, so we are saying that there is something governing the architecture today, which is not closely related to the people, which is not closely related to the ecology of the place or environment of the place, which is not necessarily related to the culture of a place. Now, this is a provocative statement, because you can also say that possibly anonymity is a cultural trait of modern societies. And if you say that, maybe, then the anonymous architecture that we are coming up today has an explanatory of being rooted into a cultural practice. But that is something you will need to think about much more in depth. That can be addressed in an hour of a FDP. The third aspect that Paul Oliver talks about that we would like to elaborate upon here is about the tradition and transmission. That the traditions are sustained if they have a meaning. Now, this is a very significant thing, right? Because we may have practices, but it's very significant to purge the practices that are possibly not useful. Why? Because they may be redundant. Let's say, for example, is it really relevant to understand the technology of a horse cart in an era of automobiles? Or let's say, is it really significant to learn the skills of driving in case we've got automatic driven cars? So we need to understand that depending on the changes in the time, depending on the mutations in the way we live, depending on the kind of acceleration that we see in the societies, the cultures evolve, and the cultural products, that means building in this case, have to respond to that particular stimuli. So whatever is handed down is not necessarily good, but it's important for us to find meaning into those so that they can be transmitted over a period of time. So the meanings could be practical. That means if I have been given a watch or a pen, which is heritage for me, or else it's a heirloom, it's been given to me by my parents and it still works. Let's say we are talking about a fountain pen or whatever we are talking about, but it works, it's practical, so I'm using it today. Or else it may be symbolic. I'm wanting to have this. Why? Because it's been handed down and there's a very significant value for this particular product in our collective consciousness. Why? Because traditions are transmitted through individuals, through families, but within a larger community consciousness, right? But they are frequently of very fundamental significance for the cultures which are concerned. Okay. Now, what is the significance of a vernacular process? The wisdom to be derived from them goes beyond the economic and aesthetic considerations only. And these are the two things we think are the most significant today. If we talk about the trends of star architects, then we understand that it's the visual thing that is driving the whole thing, right? Not that they are not conceptual, they are philosophical. They may have a very sound theory behind it and a very sound practical knowledge beyond it, but vernacular processes go something beyond this. Maybe
Yes, sir.
and
So
is
your
this
slide is not visible?
Is the screen visible?
No, sir.
Now, we use these two terms interchangeably to allude to some user or community driven, not professional design.
The slide is not visible, sir.
Is it visible now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, we tend to use these terms interchangeably. Now, we must understand the use of these terms alluding to what? What I mean is, if there is something, we may call it vernacular or else we may call it traditional. So what is it that we are calling either vernacular or traditional? It's some kind of a user or community driven, sensitive and a non-professional design and built architecture that we call either vernacular or traditional. We use the terms interchangeably, whereas vernacular architecture is a time and place specific response. It is in response to a particular place, a particular climate, a particular environment at some point in time. As Professor Anand had also pointed out, over a period of time, even if the stimuli is different, if the stimuli remains the same, the things can change. So it's a time and place specific response to the local context Whereas traditional building is a continually modified process that is place specific. Continually modified process implies some kind of a, a typology like of the tombs or the temples that we talked about, which we call is the evolution of a tradition. So tradition is usually defined as the handing down of customs, beliefs, and values, and it more alludes to the process of transmission of knowledge, right? So now what are the issues and challenges that we as architects, we as educationists who are wanting to derive value from the vernacular practices, vernacular processes, and the vernacular architecture, what is it that we must learn? What are the challenges of necessity, continuity, cultural values, and the sustainability of vernacular that we need to address in this new millennium? Now, what is it that makes the vernacular architecture so very valuable? I guess you'd be aware that UNESCO has also come with a charter for conservation of these vernacular traditions of the indigenous knowledge systems. They have come up with it, and we know that the traditional practices are being recognized, and it becomes important for us to also look into these. Now, a very relevant example could be the beginning of this the Center of Indigenous Knowledge, Indian knowledge systems in the Indian context, where the AICT is driving this process of setting up centers across universities. We know there are certain examples which can offer a lot to civilization, to humanity today, which are being rediscovered in the Indian system. Let's say in the system of medicine, we are talking about Ayurveda. Maybe in the system of wellness, we are talking about yoga. In the system of conceiving the universe, we are talking about astronomy, and in the system of, let's say, talking about subatomic systems, we are talking about Vedanta. Now, there are a lot of things, even in the Indian system, that through which we are wanting to contribute. So there's some kind of an element of rediscovery involved, and there is something that we can also do in terms of understanding our traditional practices in the domain of the built environments, in the way our traditional built environments were envisaged, they were conceived, and vernacular has a very critical role within this overall framework to play. So as architects and designers, what is the kind of preparation that we've got to derive a lot of value from them in an era of globalization? We all know as architects that we are looking through our practice and our profession only in urban areas or else class 2 cities, whereas the plethora of wealth is available in places which are not really being studied, or else not that they're not being studied, but they are being studied in isolation. But considering the kind of wealth which is available, possibly the kind of thrust that we should have in our architecture education for a study of these traditional built environments or vernacular built environments or our traditional way of buildings needs a fresh impetus. And possibly what's stopping us is a kind of an implicit faith, or else in the Western technology and the social system, and also due to a lack of knowledge and understanding of the diversity of our own building traditions. Now, I think this is something that in an era of globalization that each of the cultures have started looking into, not only in domains of architecture, but each country has started looking into the strengths of their vernacular, into the strengths of their traditional, into the strengths of their cultural practices to provide solutions to the modern problems which face humanity today. And I think that is where, as architects, we need to pitch in, we need to learn from the wide wealth of vernacular practices, vernacular processes, traditional practices, traditional processes, cultural heritage, to learn from it and learn from it to provide for a new sustainable environment. And so the suggestion is that the embodied values of existing vernacular tradition should be recognized rather than repressed. That means we must not undermine those. And we must look at the indigenous cultural norms and environmental knowledge with a sense of respect. This applies to employ of the local resources and the traditional building skills, which need rediscovery. I think it started in a certain manner, but it needs a lot more impetus. Now, the overall, for a global study of vernacular architecture, there's this organization which undertakes studies globally, international studies in vernacular architecture, which I'm sure you would have heard about, ISVA. Their position statement is, and it's very relevant, that we believe it to be essential for the welfare of the environment and of the present and future generations that much more should be known about vernacular traditions so that they may be supported all over the world and architect designed buildings can relate to them. Architectural responses to building needs must be developed that respect local traditions rather than attempt to apply universal design solutions irrespective of cultural diversity and differing aspirations. I think you can go through that later, and I think I will rest this and maybe we can move on to the next. If you can share that the slide that you were talking about, Professor Anand, we can. So this is a very broad framework.
Yes, Anurag sir. This is the slide.
You can take it up, Anand, Professor.
Yeah,
Anand.
yeah. This is the slide that Amos Rappaport had, in this table, he had distributed the process characteristics and the product characteristics. And it's a table which I, felt that must be taken very seriously. And that is why I invite all of you and Professor Anurag to also contribute to discussing this table. The first thing that he says is the identity of designers. And then in the product characteristics, he says that the degree of cultural and place specificity. So Amos Rappaport is actually echoing what has been discussed already, at various places in the discourse by Dr. Anurag and our president, Habib Khan. The identity of designers is very critical to defining vernacular, because people who are making it, as I said, taking ownerships of where we are living, what we are building, is the core to vernacular. Then he says that the intention and purpose of designers. Now, and in the product characteristic, the product that is the output characteristic, he says that specific model, plan forms, morphology, shapes, and transitions, like the inside, outside, interface, entrances, etc. So, whereas he's discussing two different attributes, but here he's saying that as a process, the intention and the purpose of the designer in the case of vernacular, wherein the person in himself is an owner, is very, very pronounced and clear. And in the case of other, things like traditional, like cultural, the specific models, plan forms, morphology, shapes, and transitions are things which which can be actually borrowed, or it becomes significantly borrowable later on if we are translating vernacular into neo-vernacular or re-practicing it in modern. So he says that the product characteristic is this, but it is not independent of the process characteristic. So he's saying that the vernacular is an output of process and product. Then he's saying that the degree of anonymity of designer, एक आदमी जो अपना मकान बनाता है, एक गरीब एक झोपड़ी बनाता है, how significant is that designer to the overall cluster that he is building, to the overall history of vernacular, and to the overall understanding of the growth from vernacular. So that degree of anonymity is something which is the process characteristic vis-a-vis the nature of relationship among elements and the nature of underlying rules, which are borrowable, which are actually product characteristics. So, हम लोग as architects, we are looking at product characteristics and vernacular, but the process characteristics have been very well elucidated here. Then he says that reliance on a model with variations. Say, for example, that particular hut, the picture of which I had shown, was a circular hut. So, how many variations of circle and ovals and circles combined form a particular hut typology is something which is which can be discussed as a product attribute, but the reliability of a model with variations is something which is a process characteristic, that people were aware of circularity and how to taper that circularity into a roof form for creating their shelters is what was the process characteristic. They found making a circle with a nail in the center and a thread at the end and a twig attached to it simpler than making a 90-degree line or a rectangle. So that circularity or the organics of the shape is something which is a process characteristic, but borrowable as a presence of specific formal qualities, complexities, solid void relations, fenestrations, massing and volume. So this is the overall articulation of form. So although the form is borrowable as a product characteristic, but then the process characteristic has to be understood, that the product which comes from the process has got a certain strength, a certain tensile strength in the process itself. Now, the presence of a single model or many models is a part of the process characteristics. In the case of a hut made out of twigs or made out of adobe or made out of any other vernacular material, the process of a single model or many models depends upon the family size, the one or two workers which are putting up the hut together, and so on and so forth in the case of vernacular. But what neo-vernacular or new models of vernacular or architectural studies or intellectuals like us can take back from the product is use of specific materials, textures, and colors. So although we discuss vernacular as specific materials, textures, and colors, but when you go and look into the process, of obtaining that material, obtaining those colors, and working on those textures, that is where the process characteristic becomes very important, and we must realize that in vernacular to put the two together. Now, extent of sharing of a model and the nature of relation to landscape, site, geomorphology, etc. The sharing of a model, that is the built model, is what he's talking about, and how it related to everything around is something that he mentions here. Then the nature of schemata underlying the model and the effectiveness of response to climate. So the schemata of the model is, like I often give this example to a lot of my students as to how organic settlements begin. I tell them that maybe when a person who is a nomad settles at a particular point to make a hut for himself, he first of all spreads a sheet, a few leaves on the ground and stays there with 4 huts, with 4 sticks and a small roof. And later on converts one span in between 2 twigs into a wall, and in a furthermore, in a time to follow, observe how the first rain happens, and then he builds the rest of the walls. The person who comes and settles next tries to see how and at what point the first person has made his house, keeps a certain distance or proximity to it, and clusters it with his own house, and then the third. So say, for example, all these 3 people have a place where they offer some kind of water to sun in their cluster or in front of their house, then everybody would be respecting the sun falling into their house. But as in the case of some other vernacular, maybe Mykonos, wherein they were trying to protect their houses from thieves and robbers coming from the sea, then they would make very narrow passages where they could be stopped. So changing pressures and also pressures which are already there as practices, which we call as intangibles, So that is where it says about the schematas, Then consistency of use of a single model for different parts of house settlements and the efficiency in use of resources. So this is how he differentiates in between resources and the use of a single model. So if he's using Adobe everywhere, that is because that is one resource, and he's using Adobe everywhere with a different composition, with a different mix, with different amounts of clay and silica as constitution. So that is something that subscribes to the process part of it. Then if we look at the type of relationship amongst models used in different types of environments and the complexity of large scale due to place specificity. So we can only look at the complexity of large scale, but not the relationships in between different models. The reason why these models came up, why these clusters came up, we cannot look at it. In fact, I have posted a question to all of you in the question box debate before he broke off for so many other complexities that were happening in the Chandigarh University, to which he is an executive director. So I asked him, I said, in the olden times, when people were riding horses, when people were practicing agriculture, when the dictates of agriculture had to be incorporated in the house through a big courtyard. I mean, it's done today also. So the big courtyard in the center of the house, in the center of a barricaded site plot, wherein the produce of agriculture is put in, and it goes into different processes, and it's stored from safe and away from animals and robbers and so on and so forth. If that is a dictate of time in an agricultural community house, a house belonging to an agricultural agrarian community, if the streets are narrow to incorporate a horse or a bullock cart, so similarly, those intangibles influence the house, a house form or a village form or a cluster form. Similarly, if we look at our roads and our automobiles, then and our building bylaws also, then these are economic intangibles which are sitting on us, and they are actually trying to dictate the whole scenario of building the way the work is happening. So this is also an intangible. If you look at it from the scale of time, this is also an intangible which is actually working on our buildings today. So now moving on to other models. So he has actually detailed out a lot of processes and complexities, and I will share this particular document with you all, especially the paper from Amos Rappaport, wherein he has talked about the process and the specifics, which we can take back. So, Professor Anurag, can we conclude our discussion here? I mean, would you like
Yes,
to
we
add
can.
something to it, sir?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anurag sir, Anand sir, for your insights on vernacular architecture, interpreting the terms and insights on the definitions which are given by the specialist on historic, traditional, cultural, and vernacular architecture, and also providing us with the different research frameworks that can be worked on. We are going to take on the questions. I think some of the participants have put in the questions. Architect Sapna is asking, while professionals and academicians like us romanticize the vernacular, the common man's aspirations are different. They often want a more permanent, that is RCC roofs over their heads. So what is the new vernacular? New vernacular. Anurag sir, please take on this question first. Then I'll ask Anand sir to take on this.
Can it be a counter question? What do we mean once we are saying neo vernacular? What does the questioner think is neo vernacular?
Architect Sapna, can you please elaborate on neo vernacular? You have written it.
No, so my question was more to do with because vernacular comes from the ethos of people, their wants, their aspirations, and that's how it comes. Now, when the aspiration itself has sort of changed, then what is this thing of the vernacular that we are talking? Because, like I think what was mentioned before, now with the advent of technology and advances in transportation and all that, your the radius from which you get local material, it has increased quite a bit. So then what happens to your planning systems and building systems? And also there's a lot of decline of craftsmanship, in which case then what are we talking about vernacular? Because now when we go, I mean, I'm talking about the area where I live in, which is in Mysore. If I go out to the villages now, most people who can afford a house are building up with sometimes brick walls, and which are plastered or unplastered, but they're going in for sheet roofs because that is easier. One is Mangalore tiles and pot tiles are getting out of manufacture. They're not being manufactured so much, and this is easier. Plus, it is cheaper, and it takes lesser time to erect. So then, is there a paradigm shift in what we're calling vernacular?
Yes, I think I agree with what you are saying, Dr. Sapna. The right to pakka makan, a good house, which is, which can protect you from climate, which can be long lasting, is a right for all of us. And times have changed a lot. But nonetheless, this dialogue between vernacular, cultural, traditional, according to me, and I agree with so many other scholars who say that vernacular is a thing of the past. But nonetheless, there are certain scholars, who have tried, as I said, to talk about degrees of vernacular. Yes. And I personally feel that degree of there has to be a scale at the end of this whole FDP. I would invite you all to join in to build a degree of scales of vernacularity on which we can measure vernacularity of a particular building. Talking in terms of who built it, who was the designer, how the process was conducted, who owns it, and so many other scales which I was reading out from Amos Rappaport's, comparative tables. And while these scales will differ, say for example, if I ask a question to you and to the general people, in between Taj Mahal and Qutub Minar and a fort built on a particular hillock, which would be more vernacular? Then I would say that Taj Mahal and Qutub Minar may not be entirely vernacular, but building up a fortification to protect a city or to protect a settlement is something which is a characteristic which runs down the history. So on the scale of vernacularity, it is more vernacular. So the discussion has to be on the intermixing of values. So when you are talking about a poor person next to your on your visit to the village in Mysore who is putting up new sheets, then definitely it is their right to ensure that their housing is protected as against kacha tiles or mud or Mangalore tiles and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, the value of certain values of vernacular are preserved and intact there, wherein the owner in himself is making a change to the housing typology. So that is how I would take the question. Maybe Anurag sir can answer it.
Is this the same question we are addressing?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right. So my answer would be that I won't give a straight answer, but I'll give you a perspective. Like you now know what vernacular would imply, and it also implies that we need to learn the values of vernacular. Now the question is, do we really know what are the merits of the traditional practice there? If we know that, we need to intervene in a manner so that we give a good solution to the end user, because this is a generalization. I have nothing against it. I also agree to what you are saying, that most of the time they'll want to go in for a RCC roof. But we know that there are certain people who are working in a different way. They are getting published in Better India, they are getting published in various journals, and they're looking at an alternative route. What we are saying here is that we need to relearn the values that are embedded in our vernacular architecture. We are saying that architecture profession, we as architects, we as educators are not giving enough value to the traditional practices, to the vernacular architecture. And we must, for ourselves, decide that if we are the knowledge custodians there, how is it that we are going to address it? All right.
Right, sir.
So our solutions would be individual. Maybe you would be able to convince the client not to use RCC, and I will not be able to, and will not be able to convince the client. So he insists on a RCC thing. But the point is, as professionals, are you and me both equally equipped to respond to that query of doing a RCC roof?
So
Are we sensitized enough?
sorry to interrupt you, but here the thing is, there's no client. He's building for himself.
Yes.
That person is building for, he's not even consulting anyone. I mean, that's
Right.
what the true vernacular architecture is about. He's doing
Right.
it himself.
Right.
In that case, I think it should be a sort of a little change in the mindsets, which would probably be by putting out more awareness that traditional is more wise. That
What is our role there?
yeah.
What is our role? Do we go like lorry bakers to stay with the villagers, or do we come to urban areas to practice? Myself included. Sorry, I'm not omitting myself.
Mm.
I definitely, I'll be unable to avoid the layer of the city. We are all moving to the cities,
Yeah.
aren't we?
Yes, yes.
So we are talking about us as professionals.
Mm.
So
Sir,
we need to be aware of how do we,
the-
and we know that there are a lot of architects who are wanting to, a lot of architects who are practicing. Karnataka mein hai, or down south there are much more. There are a few in the hilly areas in Himalayas. There are a few in the northeast. It's up to us to popularize it. And now with the crisis of sustainability, I think we've got a good driver as well.
Yes.
But if we start driving along the quote unquote, the specification based norms of green buildings, then are we really addressing the issues? This is something that we need to cogitate upon. This churn has to be our profession. Professionals have to think about it. And I think this is a good forum wherein the educators are getting sensitized, as we also ourselves are doing the same. Why? Because as educators, we've got a responsibility to transfer this necessity to the students. At least sensitize them. Because as someone has put it up very rightly, and I think it's you only, you say that it's a romantic notion, and I agree with you. It's a romantic idea for us. But if we are asked to go and stay in a homestead or in a place like that, possibly we will not. So we need to make it more habitable, more palatable, more we should be more sensitized to all this. I think Reti Kamath is a practice that we all know has been doing it all along.
Correct.
We know there are a lot of people in Rajasthan who are using all these traditional things. And I have a very good example. There was a conservation architect by the name of Debashish Nair. And if we need to have these antique kind of hardwares into our building restoration works, we are buying it from the regular producers at an exorbitant price. So what did he do? He started going into all these foundries in Aligarh and started looking out at all these factories who were closed. Why? Because they didn't have any business. So he started reviving that process of getting the cultural practices into the mainstream. Right? So
Correct.
we also need to do the same. We've got occupational guilds. We know people who have excellent skills in stonecraft. We know excellent people who have skills in metal craft. We know we know that we have had all these people. We just need to find those people and employ them in our building processes. And possibly with the revival of the craft, with the revival of the practice, the expression can also be similar. Why? Because visual is only one dimension. You know?
Yeah, correct.
Eyes of the skin, matlab yahi hai na? Visual is only one dimension. And as architects today, we are fixated that only visual aspect of a building.
Sir, I'll just like to add something here. Yeah, visual is one aspect, but I think in terms of performance of the buildings, we can somewhat kind of changes be done in terms of learning from the vernacular and traditional and incorporating it in our Pakka houses as well as in RCC as well. So that can be done, and even a small level of change, if we're looking at then it is going to be there and it's going to be again developed in somewhat other ways. So that's my take on that.
Absolutely correct. I think there are examples of that also. Professor Lal, in his buildings, he says one is that what tells us we have to sit in a 24-degree-centigrade room? What tells us that we need to only have blinds? Why can't we have chicks outside the house the way the traditional houses had? I think there are videos which talk about that. We
Yes,
can
sir.
have chicks to shade us from the sun. Why do we need to have a tie and sit in 24 degrees centigrade? And if it's not 24 degrees centigrade, can 27 degrees centigrade be the new comfort norm? Like there are ab initio thinkers who are doing fundamental thinking on how, as you were saying, performance levels can be incorporated into modern buildings, and we can look into the traditional or the vernacular for that.
Yes.
These chicks, overhead planes, जो रात में पड़ जाते हैं या सुबह उठ जाते हैं सर्दियों में, और गर्मियों में सुबह पड़ते हैं और रात में खुल जाते हैं, awnings or whatever we call them.
Even the cross ventilation stack effect, it has to be well studied, and it can be incorporated in our RCC multi-storied buildings as well.
Long span
So,
stone structures.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things.
Yeah.
Performance indices can be achieved to the best. We are not saying that A can be, in traditional
Yes,
practice, A can be transferred to a super specialty hospital just
Yes.
through a transfer. It will need to be adaptive if at all it can be used. So a critical review and awareness is required. I think that's the biggest thing. Our awareness of the value of the traditional, of the vernacular. That awareness is something which is critical, and we as educators have a very critical role there. Of discovery and transmitting. Both. Transmitting perpetuates a tradition.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And we do have a lot of questions actually, but we are running out of time. Anand sir, can we take few of them, or should I just go in for asking Vani ma'am to end the session? Anand sir, I think he's not here.
2 questions.
2 questions, okay, sir. Architect Meera is asking, can we say that the true vernacular flag lies in the hands of a common man living in villages, and what lies in our hand is carrying few threads forward and incorporating them in our designs?
May I answer this question for
Yes, sir, please.
Neha, I'm answering this from my own level of understanding, and the intention of this discourse is also that we evolve our own energy to answer our questions. I personally feel that vernacular belongs to the era of craft. And yes, that era of craft is over. In today's day, we are not just living by the common knowledge of a connected society, but we are also living with very different examples of build forms which are drastically remote to what we need today. So I personally feel that vernacular is no more existent. It is not even with the villagers unless they are practicing similar traits. Our villages have been dramatically transformed. But what I personally feel is that now whatever we are doing can have degrees of vernacular. So our studies on vernacular have to be done in depth so that we can allocate those degrees, and we need to build it in our system. Like sustainability has got parameters. Similarly, vernacularity or tradition also have to have parameters. If I stretch the argument ahead into urban planning, it would become very long, but there are no templates existing to practice vernacular truly today. Anurag sir, would you like to answer Neha Pradhan's question?
Yes, I can just put in a contrast to what you answered. Drastic situations need drastic responses, right? So in context of the unsustainability of our practices, I think it's significant. Like you were saying, I agree there. We don't have a framework for a vernacular practice to be incorporated today. But can that be the template is something that I'd throw open. We've had a book called Hind Swaraj by Mahatma Gandhi, which had a detailed critique of the industrialization and industrial production. And this book, ये जो अभी नाम लिया था ना, Amitav Ghosh, talks about the unerring prescience of Mahatma Gandhi in terms of the numbers. If we adopt similar practices which are prevailing elsewhere to the kind of population and the numbers we have, possibly we are truly heading on to a unsustainable, environmentally or ecologically unsustainable system. Now, drastic situations need drastic responses. I'll throw open the question whether this can be something that we can look into. You are already aware we are talking about rural. We are talking about empowering of the means of production in villages, in cluster of villages, in class 2 cities, to stop the migration and expand the footprints of the livelihoods to other parts of the living as well. That means to the villages, to the smaller communities, to the smaller towns. So maybe I'm not 100% in agreement the age is over, or else maybe I'm alluding to what you were already talking about, scales of vernacular, but that's my thought on it.
I hope you got your answer. Architect Richa wants to ask if there are charters to address the historic. Is there any guideline to address the vernacular? Anand sir?
Yes, I think Professor Anurag had answered this question. Like, we have a lot of charters to address the historic, and similarly, there is a charter to address the vernacular also. In the ICOMOS charter, there is a provision to look into vernacular architecture. They are quite focused on it. In fact, while talking about the directives or support systems or views to look at vernacular and traditional and cultural, I also had been thinking since the morning, while I was discussing the subject of vernacular with a few of my friends from the administrative services. So they said that, Anand, you have lost a lot of buses, as an architect. He said, the person told me that the whole of the schedule 9 in our constitution comprises of acts and provisions in constitution to take care of the tribals and their culture, and special tenancy acts like the Nagpur Tenancy Act, and even Article 370 ABC, which subscribes to JNK and to the Far East, was done for taking care of their cultural and their tribal and their significant living systems. But over a period of time, with the involvement of different kind of agencies, architects have lost a lot of opportunities to jump into the mainstream and work on these articles, which would have otherwise supported the traditional and cultural and vernacular living systems. In fact, by my own personal knowledge, I'll share that while planning villages, they have a provision of a junior engineer, which is never an architect. While the junior engineer has to talk on urban planning and related issues, it's always an engineer, a civil engineer, who's doing it. I'm not against engineering, but what I'm saying is that look at everything around that we are following, starting from NBC to IGBC to green to planning our villages. It's always engineers who are at the fore of it, and we are actually following up. So we need to for our own professional sake, get out of our stylos and get more energized to address the national scenario, and address these things with more sincerity. That's all that I would say.
Thank you, sir. And now I would like Architect Vani Dua to please give the closing remarks of this first day of our FTB.
Thank you, Smita ma'am. So I hope all the participants of the FTB really had a great day, a great start to this faculty development program on vernacular. And we had a very interesting session with Architect Habib Khan, who gave us the 10 commandments for contextualizing and humanizing architecture. And he shared some very interesting projects done by him. So, and I would also like to thank Professor Anand for helping us to see the historical, traditional, cultural, and vernacular frameworks through the lenses of various researchers. And last but not the least, Professor Anurag Verma, thank you so much, sir, for joining us in spite of all your schedule problems. And you really, really iterated to all the educators that how do we need to relearn the values of vernacular. You've given us a lot of food for thought to churn on how we can make vernacular more palatable and make that paradigm shift that we all inherently want. How do we make it possible and how do we transfer it to the students? Thank you so much for sharing your views. I just want to give everybody a reminder that tomorrow we have 3 very interesting sessions by eminent speakers. So we will be starting a little early at 12:15 p.m. So please join 5 minutes prior to the session. And on the last day of the FDP, as Anand sir shared in the beginning, there will be an assessment test comprising of 60 MCQs. So make sure you all attend all the sessions and be attentive also during all the sessions. There are certain questions which we were not able to take up due to the time constraint. We want to start in time and finish in time. So we will make sure that we email your questions to the speakers and they will personally respond to you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and hope to see you tomorrow in time. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Anurag. Bye.